Okay. I see we've got quite a few people have added in. I think most of the people have joined. So why don't we go ahead and get started? First of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our webinar entitled Religious Dissent in China and the Legacy of April 25th. Before we dive in, I just want to mention that there is a button for most of you, for everybody, there's a button on the lower right side called questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through and have a discussion about April 25th and dive into that in quite some detail. If you have questions, go ahead and hit that button, questions on the lower right. And what we'll do at the end of our panel discussion, we'll open those up. We'll go through the audience questions and hopefully we can answer everything that's on your mind, and so you can put it there, and we'll get to it at the end. So before we dive in, however, we want to first give an introduction to April 25th. This is an event that some know perhaps not a whole lot about. Even the folks that know a lot about it, there tends to be a lot of misconceptions about exactly what happened, why it happened. So first, we're going to spend a few minutes and give you a little bit of background on the event itself. Then we'll open up to the panel and go ahead and have our discussion. So I'm going to switch over to the slides now. And we're first going to start with some basics. Let's talk about Falun Gong in the 1990s in China, which was a very different world than it has been in recent decades. So first of all, the very basics. What is Falun Gong? Falun Dafa, as it's also called. So Falun Gong is a spiritual practice involving meditation, slow-moving exercises, and the studying of Buddhist-based principles, particularly adopting the principles of Zhen Shanren, or truthfulness, compassion, tolerance into your life. That's what it means to practice Falun Gong. And it actually has roots that go back millennia in China. There were a lot of these self-cultivations, Shulian practices in China for thousands of years, and normally was taught privately, teacher to student, with the goal of improving yourself, becoming more selfless, things of this nature. So Falun Gong has roots in that spiritual tradition in China. In 1992, Mr. Li Hongzhi made Falun Gong public, and he did so mainly through a series of lectures. So starting in 1992, and usually at invitation of government, sometimes NGOs, different organizations around the country, he gave a series of 54 lectures over a little bit more than a span of 2 years, from 1992 to 1994. And that's how Falun Gong was introduced to the public. Now, initially, it grew very fast by word of mouth, mainly because people were trying it and they find that it was very good for the health. And so, chronic health problems were going away. And so they were sort of telling friends and family. And so that's how it initially became very, very popular. However, as people started studying the principles, they realized there was more to Falun Gong than just exercises. This was really, in some ways, a spiritual renaissance in China, in that it reached back into these deep spiritual traditions and brought them forward into the modern era. And so that's when the practice really took off across the country. In 1996, so 4 years after Mr. Li first made it public, the main book of Falun Gong, Zhuang Falun, was a bestseller in China. And there was a lot of government support. So here you can see, this is actually a photo of Mr. Li giving a lecture at the Ministry of Public Security University in China. And there was a lot of government support because they saw how beneficial this was for people. So again, Mr. Li was being invited to give lectures around China. He was getting letters of appreciation. State-run media was covering him in some respects about how the healing efficacy of the practice and just sort of the overall well-being the practice was bringing to Chinese people, what it was like. And so by the end of really 1998, you had 70 to 100 million people practicing, and not just like in one region or one strata, it was everywhere. It was in parks in large cities, small villages. It was on university campuses, rural farm areas. So Falun Gong was really everywhere in China in the latter part of the 1990s. And so here's a little bit of what you're seeing. And these are really state-run media of some of what they're saying and covering about Falun Gong in that time. So here's a piece from Shenzhen Star Times in 1998, and a quote from an official from the National Sports Commission of China, again 1998, about the efficacy of Falun Gong and the benefit it's bringing to society. So that was really the picture of Falun Gong in 1990s. Very, very different than what we've seen in recent decades. So here's just a few photos, just to bring it home. This is what a practice site where people would come in the morning together and do the exercises. This is what it looked like in Beijing, Jiamusi, Shenyang, down south in Guangzhou, China, Chengdu. So this is really what Falun Gong looked like. Now, we tend to think of the CCP as a sort of monolithic entity, which to some extent it is, but it also is comprised of a lot of factions. And so what's important in understanding April 25th is to understand that there were different factions in the CCP. And as early as 1996, some factions, one in particular, was sort of looking at Falun Gong in an opportunistic way. And what we learned later, in a way to sort of maybe build up an enemy so that we can build a political campaign around it, things of that nature. So what does that mean? Well, even as early as 1996, as the book was a bestseller, it technically was at that point in the latter part of that year officially banned, even though it was still somewhat available via pirated copies and things of that nature. Also, Mr. Lee withdrew Falun Gong from the Qigong Science Research Association because he felt that they wanted to impose rules to make money off Falun Gong. He didn't want to do that, keep Falun Gong freely available. Whoever wants to learn it can learn it without paying a penny. And so that happened as early as 1996. And then what you have over the next few years, again, while by and large Falun Gong is being very celebrated and tens of millions of people are taking up the practice, you did see beginnings of state-run media attacks, sort of calling it superstition or starting to do what the state-run media and CCP often does to a group when they're looking to attack it. And you also had these sort of investigations or studies that were launched. One by the Public Security Bureau in 1996, where, and it's clear from the record, they came up with a conclusion first. We need to prove that Falun Gong is a heretical teaching, is what they call it. And then they launched the investigation to try and find the evidence for that. No evidence found in that particular investigation. There was another one done by Bureau Number 1 of the Ministry of Public Security, and that was a little bit more aggressive. You started to see some limited phone tapping, ransacking of homes, again, in a limited capacity, but that was a much more aggressive campaign. The State Sports Commission itself launched an investigation in 1998, and they came back and as is the case with all these investigations, and found actually there's no harm in Falun Gong. It's excellent. It's good for social stability, ethics, health. But these investigations were going on, and periodically there was a negative article in some of the state-run media during this period of time. So that's really the stage, and it's important to understand that context when we look at April 25th, which didn't really just fall out of the sky. So how did that happen? Well, the lead up into April 25th really goes to a few days earlier. In April 11th in Tianjin, nearby Beijing, there was another one of these sort of negative articles, and so Falun Gong practitioners went there to try and talk to the media outlet and explain, what they got wrong, and just explain so they can come to know Falun Gong better. What's unique about that, unlike the previous instances of the last few years, is the Falun Gong practitioners were beaten and arrested. And that was different. And so that word got out to Falun Gong community, certainly in the Northeast, but around the country. And then they were told, look, if you have a complaint about what happened in Tianjin, don't come here, take it to the appeals office in Beijing. And that's a really key thing to understand. We'll talk more about that with the panel here, is that officials were telling Falun Gong practitioners, go to Beijing, go to the appeals office, take your complaints there. And so that's what happened. And on the morning of April 25th, more than 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners gathered together and went to Beijing to the appeals office. They didn't circle the compound as some media had talked about. They were really going to the appeals office, but there were a lot of them, and so they started to be lined up along the streets near and around Zhongnanhai. So that was really the background and the buildup to what happened in April 25th. And just to give you some footage, I'm going to just play a short clip. It's about a minute, just so you get a sense of what that looked like.
The protest that changed China.
It scared the living daylights out of the party central command.
10 years after Tiananmen Square It's the eve of the millennium, and 10,000 people silently gather in front of the homes of China's leaders. They come quietly, and they leave quietly, but their voice has been heard.
It put Falun Gong on the map as a force in China.
3 months later, the crackdown. Thousands are arrested, tortured, and killed. It's the beginning of a genocide that continues today.
The decision that they will ban Falun Gong, the decision was made on April 25th.
So that just gives you sort of a sense of what it looked like on that day. And of course, now looking back, that was 25 years ago. Over that 25 years, a massive campaign nationwide has been going on to suppress, to eradicate Falun Gong. Millions have been detained and imprisoned, hundreds of thousands of torture cases. We know more than 5,000 have died from torture, and that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg of the cases we can verify. And according to the China Tribunal, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, have been killed out of the crime of forced organ harvesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's sort of the background of April 25th and what led up to it and what was going on. So let's bring in the panel now, and we'll have a discussion about this. So just to introduce briefly our panel members. First, we have Sarah Cook, an independent researcher who authored not only Freedom House's Battle for China's Spirit, but many other reports in Freedom House, doing some excellent work on Falun Gong and China more broadly. She's joining us here today. We've got the Falun Dafa Information Center's Larry Liu, who's the director of our government and advocacy here. And also, we're thrilled to have Weiyu Wang, who was actually there on the day. He was a student at Tsinghua, a doctoral student, and he was there, and he went through a number of ordeals that we'll be talking about today. So that's our panel. We want to welcome everybody. And let's see. Let's start with you, Weiyu. You were there. You were on the day. Walk us through that day. Why did you go? What did you see? What were you thinking at the time?
Okay, thank you, Levi. Thanks for the introduction of the background. Yes, on April 25th, 1999, I went to the State Council in Beijing to appeal, and I stayed there for the whole day. Thanks for the introduction of the background. I just want to share something I experienced. Just as you said, yes, April 25th incident is not an isolated incident. In 1999, I was a third-year doctoral student at Tsinghua University. By that time, I had been practicing Falun Dafa for over 2 years. Since 1998, I gradually became aware that due to the increasing popularity of Falun Gong among Chinese people, so there were more and more various restrictions from the CCP, the national leadership. For example, it became more and more difficult to buy authentic copies of the book, Zhuan Falun, as you just introduced the book, the bestseller book at that time, after 1998. So I have experienced 2 incidents before April 25th. So the first one, I call it Beijing TV station incident. As you know, that happened in 1998. At that time, I remember my schoolmate, John, and I heard a report on Beijing TV that, claiming that practicing Falun Gong could lead to mental illness. So based on our several years of practice and the personal experiences, it was evidently false information. So that needs to be addressed. So John and I rode our bicycles to Beijing TV station. There, we met a staff member, and we explained the truth following our practice of Falun Gong. And the staff member told us that many people had come in the previous days to explain their situations. So I think the Beijing TV station incident was initiated by a person named He Zuxiu. Several months later, he made up another story in Journal of Tianjin Education College, again, to slander Falun Gong. That is the second incident. He Zuxiu has a relative, I think most people know his name, named Luo Gan, who is in charge of the National Security Department, at that time. So This incident reflects the Chinese Communist Party's desire to find an excuse to suppress Falun Gong at that time. So on April 24th, that's just one day before the petition of April 25th, I heard in the practice site of our university that the Tianjin police beat Falun Gong practitioners at Tianjin Education College, and even illegally arrested them. Additionally, the Tianjin Police Department stated that they won't release them without the command from Beijing. At that moment, I realized the Tianjin Police Department was implying this incident originated from the orders of authorities in Beijing. So based on the historical experience, if this incident left unaddressed, Falun Gong would soon be prohibited by the national leaders. Thus, I have to approach petition office in Beijing. So that's the background of mine. So on April 25th, 1999, that is Sunday, coinciding with the university's anniversary celebration, I remember clearly that the weather forecast predicted rain, which caused me some concern. I opted to take the bus, and it stopped at a station on the road north of the petition office called Wenjin Road. After getting off the bus at Wenjin Road, I noticed that many people were already there. It was obvious that most of them were not locals from Beijing. They were asking about the location of the Beijing petition office. It was then that I realized they shared the same purpose as me. I followed the crowd toward the petition office, first heading west, and then I'm making a left turn. At this point, I overheard someone ahead mentioning that the petition office had closed. Subsequently, I followed the crowd to the nearby Fuyu Street, which runs north to south. There, I saw a gate and realized it was the west gate of the state council in Zhongnanhai. At that moment, like everyone else there, I was not sure how to explain our situation to the national leadership. I thought we should wait for the leaders to come out. So we stood on the sidewalk on the west side of Fuyu Street, with the state council located on the east side. I think you just saw it in the video. That was just one street between us, and I heard some fellow practitioners suggest that we should just try to leave half of the sidewalk clear to avoid blocking traffic. Soon the street was filled with people petitioning. The atmosphere remained orderly without any commotion. Then I observed the police officers arrive and line up on the street, just on our side, I mean the west side of Fuyu Street. It's spaced several steps apart. Since we didn't know how to reach the national leaders, we could only stand quietly and wait, or do some reading or communicating with each other with soft voices without any protest actions. I noticed some fellow practitioners explaining to the police officers why we had come here. Initially, I observed the officers being somewhat tense, but after about 1 hour, they saw that the practitioners were peaceful and well-intentioned, so they became more relaxed. Before long, I saw a peculiar individual on Fuyu Street, moving in an erratic manner, seemingly odd. I overheard someone pointing at him, remarking, that person is He Zuoxiu, who slandered Falun Gong at Beijing TV station and Tianjin Education College. While standing there, I overheard someone mentioning, moments ago, Jiang Zemin visited here for inspection, and he was greatly angered at the situation. So after some time, I heard that Premier Zhi Rongji rushed back from the university's anniversary celebration and requested a few representatives to explain the situation. I heard that several people went in, but I wasn't aware of who they were. As the day gradually turned into evening, I overheard someone saying, the representatives have come out and reported that the situation in Tianjin has been resolved. Those who were arrested have been released. Let's go back home. So that's almost the whole process. Therefore, I took the bus back. And I remember some practitioners shared the story with the driver, what had happened during the day. The driver expressed understanding and empathy, towards our actions. So that is what I experienced on April 25th. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Weiyu. Larry, let's move over to you. You were in the U.S. at that point. You were practicing Falun Gong, but you were at the U.S. What did you think? What was going on with the community here? What were you seeing? What were you thinking was unfolding? Oh, Larry, I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Levi. I was a PhD student at Washington University in St. Louis at that time, and I remember seeing the news about April 25th's appeal from a website maintained by some Falun Gong practitioners in the U.S. I think at that time it was called a Buhuo.net, website. So I was certainly surprised. I have learned about some of the things going on, like what we described in 1998, some of the media slandering Falun Gong and how practitioners in China peacefully appealed to them, and they corrected the wrong stories later on, including the Beijing TV station incident. But this one was certainly surprising to me. But then also later on, I learned that my mother was in China practicing Falun Gong at that time, and she later on told me that she also heard about the news about the arrest in Tianjin, and she was planning to go to Beijing to appeal. And she lived in Fushun City, that was like 500 miles from Beijing, north of Beijing. And but when she was about to leave, and then she just learned that the appeal was over, because it was peacefully resolved. Everybody went home, and so she didn't go. And at that time, I remember also seeing some of the Western media. I think that was U.S. News and World Report, I believe, was the first major U.S. media first reporting on Falun Gong in February 1999, and that was mainly about Chinese government's support to Falun Gong because of its health benefit and moral teachings at that time. And so for vast majority, I think that was probably the only one major U.S. media first reported Falun Gong before the April 25th appeal. So April 25th appeal was probably the moment of vast majority of the whole Western world first learn about Falun Gong. And I remember seeing some of the news report, they didn't even know how to call Falun Gong. There wasn't even an English name for Falun Gong. Some of them just call it a Buddhist law. And and I remember, seeing those Western media, sometimes they made some comparison with Tiananmen Massacre, because that was exactly 10 years ago. And some of them noticed the difference. The Tiananmen Massacre, the Tiananmen student movements were certainly peaceful, but they were also loud. There were a lot of slogans, banners, but they saw this one is so different. It was so quiet. There was no slogan. There was no banner, but I remember seeing some of the media, kind of speculating what Chinese government is going to do with that. So that was kind of the, how I learned about this event.
Yeah, I remember that as well. I mean, some of those reports comparing the two. I think, in hindsight, what I didn't know at the time, but I think one of the things they really got wrong, or what they missed, was, at least in comparison to June 4th, where June 4th was looking for governmental change, policy change. I mean, it was really sort of making a series of demands to democratize. Whereas I think what people missed about April 25th was that this is really a bunch of people that were really just going to the appeals office because they thought there was a genuine misunderstanding. And it was just going there to sort of follow the legal procedure of making an appeal. And I think that was one of the things, that you mentioned, those news reports from back then, that I saw was missing in hindsight. So that was interesting. So that was the Western media. Now, Sarah, maybe we could bring you in and talk about what did the CCP do with this in terms of propaganda? What are the narratives that you saw come out, and how does that fit into the patterns from your research?
Thanks. Thank you. And I'm really glad to be here. Look, I think one of the things to keep in mind for those who maybe aren't as familiar with China is just how tightly controlled the media in China are. There are no private media. It's not even, there's the flagship publications, there's like the CCP mouthpieces, there's an official news agency, there's a national broadcaster, and the evening news has to be played on every single station at the same time. There's like one evening news broadcast, right? So I think it's in that context that, just going back to some of the examples that way you talked about, that state-run media is also one of the ways that, people like me try to read the tea leaves of what the Chinese and ordinary Chinese. So that's one reason why I think when people were seeing certain news articles that were starting to take a more false approach and more aggressive approach to Falun Gong, some of the, Chinese citizens got freaked out because they were reading the tea leaves. Basically, they were like, wait, where is this coming from? This isn't accidental. This isn't just a single reporter who had some kind of, altercation with someone, or I don't know, misunderstood Falun Gong. This is clearly something that, things don't get through editorially without some kind of higher approval. That's just the way the media work in China. And so I think you see that as the reporting on April 25th. So I think at that time, actually, like Larry said, he heard about it and it was widely reported in the Western media. It wasn't really reported inside China widely in the Chinese state media, partly because the Chinese government didn't really want to necessarily admit that there were all these people who had lined up in Beijing to appeal to the central government. And so I think actually over the coming months, the party and the state media were relatively quiet. And even one Human Rights Watch report talked about how the leadership was, quote, ominously quiet, because of course, we'll talk in a little bit about what was happening behind the scenes. But I think what you see happening then is that the set of retroactive accusations that after July 20th, after Falun Gong was banned, and this broader propaganda blitz happens to try to demonize Falun Gong and try to justify this violent campaign and the ban, that's when you start to see Chinese state media suddenly declaring that this Falun Gong incident was, quote, a most serious political incident, starting to use words like that it was a siege, that it was a threat to social stability. And I think to Levi's point earlier, I think one of the distinctions, that does get missed, and I think was missed by Western media, but is certainly part of what the party tried to twist in its reporting, was that fundamentally what Falun Gong practitioners were asking was for the freedom of belief. They were asking for the people who had been arrested in Tianjin to be released. They were asking for, I think maybe for Zhuan Falun, for the book to, be permitted publication, or for them to be allowed to register, because they had, been trying to register actually with, not they had removed from the Qigong Association, but they'd actually been trying to register with various other governmental Ministry of Civil Affairs and things like that. So essentially, it was fundamentally really an appeal about their own community and the freedom to practice their faith. It was not, at the time, it was not a call for broader political reform. It was not an attempt to, quote, overthrow the Chinese government. But I think because of what ended up happening in terms of the location, that was sometimes how Western observers saw it. That was certainly the way in which Chinese state media then later painted it in order to try to justify the violent campaign that happened. And I think just in terms of the pattern that this fits into, that's very common. When you have protests and various forms of dissent, including ones like June 4th, where people like 1989, where people were calling for, more political and governance reforms. Again, often really as much related to corruption and anti-corruption issues as they were in terms of electoral democracy. Or with regards to Hong Kong and the protests in 2019, where people were trying to stop this an extradition law. And so what you see this twisting of these nonviolent protests, into by the party propaganda into being something that was seemingly to be much more aggressive, potentially violent. I remember meeting a Chinese student who had studied overseas, and was studied in the U.S. and was talking about how when they got here, they learned what had really happened on June 4th and how shocked they were because they had always been told that it was the students who were firing on the army rather than the other way around. And I think just more recently with the Hong Kong protests in 2019, you saw all kinds of things from like Chinese state-run television, especially the CCTV, the national broadcaster, sharing graphics, comparing the protesters to Islamist militants, to child soldiers. and just sharing fabrications, saying they were carrying U.S.-made grenade launchers when actually these were actually toy guns that some of the protesters were carrying symbolically. So I think you see this pattern with the Chinese propaganda of trying to twist often what are peaceful appeals or protests, even ones that have more of a political nature than what the Falun Gong one in 1999 had, into something that is something people think was violent or was meant to quote, to really like overthrow the government or something like that. And so they really played into that set of narratives. And I think the fear that Chinese people have, or anybody would have, of some kind of violent revolution being instigated when they're creating the narratives and the propaganda about Falun Gong. But again, this only happens later. This doesn't happen in April. In April to July, they're actually trying to say, we're not sure, maybe just don't repeat the appeal, but there really wasn't a lot of conversation. It was only later, after Falun Gong, the persecution started, that they came out with these types of narratives.
So on that note, Weiyu, let's go over to you. So April 25th happens. Everybody goes home that night. 3 months later, the persecution happens. But that next day, we don't know that. What was going on? What was going through your head, your friends and family, as you went into the end of April, into May and June? Talk to us a little bit about what that was like.
Okay, thank you, Levi. Yes, that's a good question. I think the social atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense after April 25th. The pressure on Falun Gong practitioners was growing, yes. I thought at that time probably the CCP will issue a ban on Falun Gong because, we lived in China, we know what the CCP did before. So on the day just after the April 25th incident, April 26th, I was called by the secretary of the CCP branch in my department of the university. During our conversation, he mentioned that as early as 1998, they had begun monitoring Falun Gong practitioners on campus. And we were among those, being surveilled. From this, it became evident that, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, had long desired to suppress Falun Gong. The April 25th incident was merely an excuse they sought. Later, when there was a need to escalate the persecution of Falun Gong, the April 25th incident was insufficient. So, as you know, on January 23rd, 2001, the eve of the Chinese New Year, the CCP staged a so-called Tiananmen Square self-immolation incident. They just kind of something orchestrating it themselves to justify the intensified persecution. So I'm not sure if you read the book or saw the video of this false fire. I think it has analyzed and exposed this fabricated self-immolation incident, which has become known to the world. This is a common tactic employed by the CCP throughout various historical periods. Those interested can just refer to this book, Non-Commentary on a Communist Party, for further insights. So for me, I experienced something maybe that's very different from others. At that time, the CCP secretary of the department convened a meeting with my classmates. They were required to speak one by one and criticize me face to face. One classmate, I still remember, stood up and announced, "If you practice Falun Gong again, I will stab you to death." After the meeting, I remember the CCP secretary of the department said to me, "Don't commit suicide." At the same time, I also received messages from my parents. They were asked by the heads of their companies to keep an eye on me and make me follow the orders from CCP. Although the then Chinese Premier Zhongnanhai reasonably resolved the incident, I heard the paramount leader of the Chinese Communist Party at the time, Jiang Zemin, just determined to persecute Falun Gong. He pointed at Zhongnanhai's nose and shouted, confused, bring ruin to the party and the country. Thus, under Jiang Zemin's command, the CCP launched the brutal persecution of hundreds of millions of Falun Gong practitioners on July 20th, 1999. That is what I experienced just after April 25th.
So, Sarah, in the later years, you and other folks, I think, at Freedom House really looked at CCP internal documents. You gained some insight of exactly what the CCP was thinking and doing at this time. Talk to us a little bit about that. And
sure. So I think it does seem clear that Jiang Zemin himself, pretty soon after April 25th, had kind of made this decision to really ban Falun Gong. I think then what happens between April and July are there are really a few, I would say 3 key steps that start to take place and really end up being the lead up. One critical one actually happens in early June. And it's when Jiang Zemin calls a special meeting of the Politburo. So that's like the top echelon of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's where he really declares that Falun Gong is a serious challenge to the regime's authority and referred to it as, quote, something unprecedented in the country since its founding 50 years ago. And it's at that meeting that Jiang essentially issues 2 orders. One, that the party needs to immediately organize forces and get fully prepared for, quote, disintegrating Falun Gong. 2, he creates what's called the special leading group. And so the party, China has the government and you've got kind of the party apparatus in parallel. And of course, the party apparatus is the one that's like making all of the decisions. And then sometimes the government and state apparatus implements it. And so within the party and the top, they would create these leading groups and they have different ones on the economy, on different issues. And so this is actually one of the few ones that was created for this type of, honestly, political campaign targeted at a particular group. And so he creates this special leading group specifically to handle the, quote, Falun Gong problem is what they call it. And he puts Li Lanqing, who's from the kind of political security apparatus side of the party, in charge. And so that's really when the security apparatus really starts to hit the gas pedal in terms of preparing for the persecution, and creates 3 days later what's known then as the 610 office, because it was created on June 10th. And this is like this extra legal security agency that ended up being very, very, very powerful because it was able to instruct judges on how they should rule in Falun Gong cases, lawyers on whether they can visit their colleagues and visit their clients in labor camps, or Falun Gong practitioners where they can get a passport to leave the country and things like that. So it really becomes a 610 office that runs the day-to-day operations. And so that's one of the key things that's happening behind the scenes in early June. I think another thing that's happened, and we know this there's actually one officer, a former officer of the 610 office. His name's Hao Fengjun. And in 2005, he defected to Australia. And he was actually working in Tianjin. And you can read some of his accounts from his perspective. He was a police officer when he was called to that protest in Beijing, and his perspective that he was told that these were, again, violent protesters, and he gets there and it's these like people meditating and often many older people, very peaceful. And he's kind of like, what's this all about? But one of the things he says is that during that period after April 25th is exactly what Weiyu was saying in terms of that they really were told to enhance collection of information about Falun Gong practitioners, really to start making a roster, essentially, of people who were known in their local communities to be practicing Falun Gong. And the thing with the 610 office was, even though it was a relatively new entity, it was created kind of within the rubric of this whole hierarchy of what are called political and legal committees, which are CCP committees that run parallel to the real legal system. So once at the top they create a 610 office, you started basically having these little cells of the 610 office throughout the CCP hierarchy all over the country. And so that's where someone like Hao Fengjun, they were tasked to start collecting information. I think the third thing that happens is actually really preparing the propaganda blitz, because what you see happening on July when the persecution is lost is just the airwaves are just swamped with various different stories, some about April 25th, some other fabrications and other claims and things like that, trying to, again, demonize Falun Gong. And so just to give you an example, there's one well-known program by China Central Television, that's the party-controlled national television station, called Focus Talk. And it's often been used, and it's kind of a supposed investigation program. And sometimes it actually investigates, or supposed corruption by local officials. But a lot of times it's suddenly then used to really attack the enemies of the CCP. So there have been like, quote, documentaries about the Dalai Lama. There were a bunch related to the Hong Kong protests more recently. Well, just to give you a sense of the scale, back in July 1999, they aired 28 episodes in 32 days. And so you don't just produce 28 episodes targeting a particular community with all these so-called investigations where they're talking to this person and that person and things like that. That's not something that happens overnight. For anybody who's worked at any kind of television production, this takes weeks, even months to produce. And they had that just ready to go within the first month of the persecution. So I think that's also one of the things that was happening behind the scenes in terms of seeing how the party apparatus was getting galvanized during this period between April 25th and July 20th to launch the campaign. I think just one last thing I would add in terms of this question of why the persecution, why did this all happen? I mean, look, I think the CCP generally does not tolerate groups that it sees placing any kind of authority, including spiritual authority, above their allegiance to the party. Falun Gong's popularity and the sheer scale of the people practicing and their diversity, including people in the military and security apparatus, freaked certain people out in the party. But I think part of what happened was that Falun Gong actually slipped through the cracks because it had spread as a Qigong practice. And then it had continued to spread while it was trying to register. It was not considered an official religion, and so was not actually controlled by the CCP in the way that religions in China were then and continue to be now. And so it kind of slipped through this loophole in the party's ideological defenses. And so in some ways, you might think like some kind of conflict or some kind of effort by the party, given its authoritarian nature, given its kind of being a total control freak, to take that control back, what was perhaps inevitable. But I think this question of the role of people like Zhu Rongji versus Jiang Zemin, one person I interviewed when I was doing the research for the 2017 report had actually been a speechwriter for another member of the Politburo Standing Committee, so one of the very powerful and then left and is now in the United States. And he was also saying, look, there were a lot of members of the Politburo Standing Committee. They knew people who practiced Falun Gong. They had family who practiced Falun Gong. They really didn't think it was a threat. But it was really Jiang Zemin that pushed it through. And so I think then when you have a party system like the CCPs in China, once Jiang Zemin makes that decision, once he creates his leading group at the very top, he presses the button. And then just this massive campaign of persecution gets launched. So, so one of those what ifs is what if Zhu Rongji had been party secretary? Maybe then there might have been, maybe this would have been resolved differently and maybe not as violently. But to some extent, some type of, potential reining in of control over Falun Gong that had kind of slipped through the cracks of the CCP was perhaps inevitable, whether April 25th would have happened or not.
Okay, let's shift gears over to the United States, other parts outside China. Larry, talk to us a little about, rewind a little bit in terms of if there's something notable you'd like to reflect on or share with us in terms of what happened after April 25th, but certainly after July 20th. Talk to us about that, the immediate aftermath here in the US and other countries.
Sure. Between April 25th to July, and at that time, I remember I was rather naively thinking that, Chinese government wouldn't do something really bad, because they already said that they wouldn't interfere in any Qigong activities, and, Premier Zhu Rongji peacefully resolved everything. So I remember in that summer, we're in summer break, so we had some parties. I remember some of my Chinese friends, classmates, just told me, Larry, you got to be careful. The Communist Party won't let this go easily. And so this is not something as simple as you think. At that time, I remember I was trying to assuage their concern because I just told them that we don't have any political motivation. We don't really seek any political power or agenda, and there may be some misunderstanding. I hope once the government really understand us, and then the problem should be resolved. So when the persecution really happened on July 20th, and I was shocked. I couldn't really believe it, actually. And but then, then the next question will be, what are we going to do? We know that partitioning in China, and at that time they went to different, like my mother even went to the provincial government. Some practitioners in China went to city government, provincial government, some went to Beijing to appeal. And we genuinely believed the Chinese government really misunderstood us. And so at that time, I thought, okay, practitioners in China, they can go to Beijing, they can go to provincial government to appeal, but where can we appeal? So we thought, okay, Chinese embassy in Washington. So that's how, you know, a group of us from St. Louis, we just rent a van, you know, and we drove to DC, and nobody told us what to do. Actually, nobody organized, and we just thought that's the place to go. And then when we got there, we also saw some other practitioners from other city also went to DC, and so I ended up spending about 3 weeks in DC that summer and just try to appeal to Chinese government, and we bring in a letter to them. And also, you know, we try to appeal to our congressmen, senators at that time. We didn't even know what's the difference between Senate and House at that time, because, you know, most practitioners of Falun Gong have no interest in politics. And we don't really want to be involved in politics at all. We just want to stay alone, you know, leave us alone, basically. That's what we want. But then, you know, starting from that moment until now, 25 years later, this persecution is still continuing. And, you know, as you mentioned earlier, that millions of practitioners have been detained, you know, in various detention facility, labor camps, you know, psychiatry institute, brainwashing centers, etc. For example, in 2009 State Department Human Rights Report, they estimated at least half of the labor camps inmates across China were Falun Gong practitioners at that time. And also rampant state-sanctioned torture against Falun Gong practitioners. And I remember in 2006, State Department report, they quoted the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Manfred Novak, and his report estimated about 2/3, you know, 66% of reported torture in Chinese labor camp detention facilities were against Falun Gong practitioners. And so far, right now, there are over 5,000 documented death cases due to the persecution. But these are only the people we know their name, we know how they died, and their family members were willing to send their information overseas. There are a lot more people we don't know, actually. And also the China Tribunal in 2019, you know, which is independent tribunal in London, and they spent a year to investigate about the allegation of forced organ harvesting on prisoners of conscience in China. And they draw the conclusion that it has been carried out in large scale, and there are hundreds of thousands of victims of forced organ harvesting. That means these people have been killed and their organs have been sold for profit, and majority of these people were Falun Gong practitioners. And so this is usually the largest, the longest running, and the most brutal religious persecution in modern Chinese history. It continues to this very day.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Weiyu, after the persecution was launched on July 20th, I mean, outside China, we were seeing the images. We were seeing, you know, massive, you know, that night, I think volunteers were pulled out of their beds in the middle of the night, July 20th, a massive roundup going around the country. Within days, or maybe it was a few weeks, there were so many Falun Gong practitioners in China being detained, they had to hold them in stadiums. And that's what we were seeing in the United States. We saw, you know, all these practitioners being held in these various stadiums around the country. You talk about your experience after July 20th. What happened to you, and what was the sort of, you know, there was a spirit of peacefully appealing that really typifies April 25th. What were you, your friends and your family who were practicing, your community, what were you doing in China after July 20th? Tell us about that story.
Okay, thank you, Levi. Yes, just as you said, yeah, that's a tough period for us. It's a difficult experience. I think you know, just like Larry said, we went through a process. Initially, our first thought was that to, you know, continue appealing to reflect the actual situations, but later we realized that the Chinese Communist Party decided to suppress Falun Gong because they feared more and more people were taking up the practice. The CCP knows the Falun Gong practitioners were, you know, are good people, It is precisely because the peaceful Falun Gong group has gained people's hearts that they are considered a threat to the regime. So they know that the Chinese people no longer believe in the communism, I think. Therefore, the CCP fabricates various lies to deceive the public, inciting them to hate Falun Gong and the Falun Gong practitioners, and encouraging them to join in the persecution of, Falun Gong. Thus, it becomes crucial, I think, to clarify the truth to the public, exposing the CCP's evil intentions, as it becomes the very important method to stop the persecution. So I just want to list something I did after July 20th, but I start from the day before July 20th. The day before July 20th, July 19th, I was in my hometown at that time. We could only go to the capital of Shandong province to appeal because the trains were already under government control. However, our bus was intercepted by the armed police. We were forced to return to our hometown, where we were subjected to a day of compulsory education by the local security department before being allowed to return home. Since then, my family and I have been placed on the government's blacklist. The school ordered us to renounce practicing, forbade us from attending classes if we didn't give up practicing Falun Gong. After September 1999, I returned to Beijing. At that time, I didn't know what to do. I just hoped to communicate with fellow practitioners and understand the situation. When I met with fellow practitioners, we were arrested by the police. We were forced to squat on the ground overnight. The police told us that gathering and conversations involving more than 3 people were prohibited. When fellow practitioners attempted to practice in the morning, they were also arrested by the security department. I have some examples here. So on June 19th, 2000, Zhao Xin, a female Falun Gong practitioner from Haidian district, Beijing, went to Zijuyuan Park to practice Falun Gong. 3 days later, she was beaten by guards in the detention center, resulting in a shattered cervical vertebra, blindness in one eye, paralysis of her entire body, and she passed away half a year later. Yuan Jiang, a graduate of Tsinghua University, was dismissed from his job after refusing to renounce his faith. In 2001, he was beaten to death by police in Gansu province. In 2000, Liu Zhimei, a female student from Department of Chemical Engineering at Tsinghua University, was suspended from school. During her detention, she was tortured and beaten by the guards. She was injected with poison every day until she became delirious. After being released from prison ahead of schedule, he suddenly passed away. So I think she was released because the guards knew she couldn't live longer. I was once tortured all night by the prison guards, prison guards with several electric batons. They stabbed the sharp tips of the batons into my back and then shocked me with electricity. Another practitioner, Wu Jun, he was not allowed to close his eyes for 25 days. In the end, his spirit was almost on the verge of collapse. Yes, it's true that thousands of Falun Gong practitioners have been tortured to death at that time. Finally, we realized CCP persists in suppressing Falun Gong practitioners precisely because they know Falun Gong is good. Thus, spreading the truth to the public becomes necessary and significant to stop this persecution. We share the facts of the CCP's cruel persecution of Falun Gong practitioners by emailing minghui.org, distributing flyers, leaflets with the truth to the public, or showing banners and slogans in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and elsewhere. Although Falun Gong practitioners have endured immense sacrifices, they have also enabled more and more people in China, just like Larry, all over the world, to know the truth and to see the evil nature of the Chinese Communist Party. So that is also, that's a very difficult time for us. But after that time, we understand what CCP is. So that is very helpful for our other days after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Weiyu. So about the efforts you talked about, making leaflets, trying to let your fellow neighbors, your community, people know about what's happening to Falun Gong. I mean, there has been a track record of 25 years of both inside China and to some extent outside China of this peaceful disobedience, these various efforts to expose the persecution and eventually to let people be more clear, what is the nature of the CCP? Why are they doing this to Falun Gong, and what threat do they pose more broadly? So Larry, you've been, I think, sort of at the center of this for more than 25 years now. Help us understand the response, both inside and outside China. What was it right after the persecution started? How did it evolve? And what's the nature of that response?
Yeah, I think like the way you said at the very beginning, practitioners went to, say, Tiananmen Square to appeal. Maybe the first 2 years, I think millions of practitioners went to Beijing to Tiananmen Square to appeal. And we genuinely thought that the government misunderstood us. So we gave them enough opportunity to understand us. We're not trying to overthrow the government. We don't have political motivation agenda. Let them know Falun Gong is good. But eventually we realized that that's not an issue anymore. They, no matter what, they're going to continue this. So we take this to the people, like what you said. Minghui.org estimated there are 200,000 family-run print shops in China by Falun Gong practitioners, and so they print out those leaflets, brochures, DVDs, and pass out to their co-workers, neighbors in the communities. So initially it's only about the persecution of Falun Gong and counter the narrative, the propaganda narrative against Falun Gong. But eventually we realized that through the CCP's decades of education and media control, many Chinese people, they believe so much what CCP said, and they wouldn't even listen to anything different from the official narratives. So we felt that it's very important to educate people what CCP really is. So in 2004, a historical book was published, 9 commentaries on the Communist Party. And so this is the first book that documented systematically the origin, nature, the history of the Communist Party, how they lied, what's their tactics. And inspired by this book, there is also a movement, it's called Tuida movement. Basically, it's withdrawing from the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations. And so this movement has been going on for over 20 years now, and inside China. And so it's not really a movement to overthrow the Communist Party per se. It's rather a moral, spiritual awakening movement, because people can use their pseudonym to create a party or its affiliated organization so that there is no risk for them. But the awakening of each person's conscience is genuine, because we believe that if people really learn the truth, they wouldn't want to be accomplices of CCP's persecution. And so if nobody wants to participate in the persecution will end. And so outside China, some computer scientists who practice Falun Gong in the United States, they developed some of the software called UltraSurf, Frigate, and to circumvent the internet blockade. I still remember that one of my relatives in China used to believe the Chinese government did the right thing in Tiananmen Massacre for keeping the stability, for economic growth, etc. And so after I sent him this software and he, bypassed the firewall and, was able to see the truth about all these events, and he completely changed his view on, Tiananmen Massacre and also other issues. And so also outside China, many Falun Gong practitioners making phone calls, sending fax, and especially making phone calls to some of the detention facilities and prisons, and to let the police, the guards know, and these are good people. And some of these guards, policemen actually stopped torturing Falun Gong after learning the truth. And also some Falun Gong practitioners founded some of the media company, for example, broadcast via satellite TV or shortwave radio into China to help Chinese people to have free access to uncensored information. So I would say this is usually the largest civil disobedience and information movement, largest civil disobedience movement and information freedom campaign in modern Chinese history.
So, Sarah, in your 2017 report, you obviously covered a wide variety of dissent. You recognize a lot of what Larry is talking about there. Talk to us a little bit about sort of what you uncovered in your research. What was the most notable? What was the most effective that you were seeing in China?
Yeah, so I think two things really stood out. I mean, one is this element of the grassroots information campaign. And I think there's two dimensions. There's kind of the higher tech stuff, and then there's the low tech stuff. The low tech is this kind of like printing leaflets and handing things out. And sometimes just even talking to people at like a public market and things like that. And then there's the higher tech stuff, which, is the circumvention tools and distributing, on USB keys, people handing out to people so they could actually download the software. And then also like just the regime and also like even people in China making phone calls and things like that. And I think what you see happening is that the regime kind of, constantly increasing its censorship and its surveillance. So then the activists kind of having to adapt and constantly innovate. And so when we were doing interviews for that report, we talked to some people who had been involved in making some of these phone calls and things like that from inside China. And they realized that, well, if I use my real phone, well, then, the Chinese government's going to find me. So now I have to get a burner phone in order to do that. And then actually somebody was like geolocated in terms of where they were making phone calls from. So then kind of a quiet message went out. If you're going to do this, then make sure to change your location. Don't do it from your home and things like that. So constantly kind of trying to escape, this grid of surveillance that the Chinese Communist Party is imposing. I think one of the things that was really notable was, one source that we used were actually court verdicts. We were able at the time to download hundreds of court verdicts of people in China who were sentenced under, quote, Article 300. That's the article of the criminal law that the Communist Party passed retroactively to handle banned religious groups like Falun Gong. And then there's a number of other kind of quasi-Christian or quasi-Buddhist groups that fall under that. By far, Falun Gong is the largest and the largest number of verdicts that we found. So we were looking at the period, and they only started publishing these in around 2014. It was like a small window when they were available. Now they've all been taken down. But we ended up with hundreds of verdicts. And when you actually read the verdicts, the sheer scale of the information dissemination really comes through, because you'll see that people are being sentenced to prison just because a single defendant was found with like hundreds of leaflets or DVDs or calendars or SIM cards. Or sometimes you see the surveillance apparatus, you can see, because they'll quote their evidence of that they're using against people, and they'll show that this person had spoke to someone in a supermarket and surveillance, there's surveillance footage of it. In other cases, they specifically mentioned the Minghui website that Larry mentioned, which is an overseas website that actually has this like little corner of kind of a toolkit for people in China. If they jump the firewall, they can access it and find easily printable, pre-formatted, leaflets and things like that. So they actually cite that, and they talk about how this person, jumped the firewall, used, quote, illegal software, jumped the firewall, accessed Minghui, download information, had 1,000 leaflets in their home and things like that. And that's what people, we did a more closer in doing content analysis. That was kind of the pre-ChatGPT and AI era, where you could do this a little more automatically. We had to do it manually. But just looking at, I think it was like the first half of 2016, there were about like 60 cases of Falun Gong that we had analyzed. All of them were freedom of expression cases. It wasn't necessary. It was people being sentenced to prison. And of course, when they're in custody, they're also being targeted for their faith. But all of it was basically because they had engaged in some kind of information dissemination, sometimes other forms of like legal appeals or things like that. And that's essentially the reprisals that they were facing. So I think when you look at also Chinese government local websites, sometimes they'll talk about all these illegal publications that they have to stop. At some point, they were really worried about you would see the 9 commentaries actually being mentioned on local government websites. So when you will look at the Chinese government's own security apparatus, that little bit that we can actually see, you see them actually talking about this grassroots information sharing. I think on a more positive kind of side, one of the things was this element of the phone calling. and other campaigns to release detained practitioners, so that a practitioner would be detained, especially if they were someone a bit better known in the community. And you'd have this mobilization of people both inside and outside of China. A lot of times there would be human rights lawyers who would come and try to help and defend that person. There was a period where you would have actually neighbors, and they would sign these petitions that trying to say, this person is good, please release them, just to put pressure on the local officials. And then these phone call teams. So we actually were able to find a woman in Europe who was like one of these coordinators for one of these phone call teams. And we talked to her about it. And so she said that like her team might make something like 3,000 phone calls in a single week on behalf of about 350 detained individuals. And you've got people in Europe, you've got people in the US, you've got these Taiwanese aunties in Taiwan. So I think this was one of the things that really stood out in terms of that transnational dimension of the dissent in the Falun Gong case in particular, where you have this mobilization of people outside of China making phone calls to the police stations, to the detention centers, saying to the police officers, look, we know you have so-and-so here. And in some cases, it actually helping people actually being released early, released on medical parole. And so I think also even talking to the human rights lawyers, there was one who was saying that he was going to defend and interview someone, and the policeman showed him this stack of letters and said, so you're his lawyer, do you know all these people? Tell all his friends to stop calling us, right? And actually that individual ended up being released kind of again. They often have to do it quietly because they don't want to get in trouble from the higher ups, right? But it does actually work, and it can reduce the torture that people face. There are anecdotes. One person we'd interviewed or had spoken to had a family member who was actually allowed to meditate in custody. The police let her do the Falun Gong meditation in jail, right? Even though technically it wasn't allowed. So you do see that kind of chipping away at honestly the loyalty of the security apparatus itself, of members, in terms of people realizing that these are good people. And that fellow that I mentioned who defected to Australia, that's exactly what he talked about how he had gotten to know a local Falun Gong practitioner in detention, had seen the scars and the abuse that she was facing, and she reminded him of his mother, and that was when he kind of decided he needed to get out, and he ended up coming out. So I think it's hard to see it's happening at the grassroots level, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the actual impact that this can have.
Yeah, as you were talking, I'm reminded about, when we did a report a couple years back about the trends of how many Falun Gong practitioners were being detained because of their civil disobedience and peaceful action. And many were surprised that went up right as COVID was peaking and shortly thereafter. And one of the things that I think is notable about that is that this grassroots network of disseminating the calling and trying to get practitioners released and trying to relieve the pressure on them is two ways. And that important news inside China actually travels over that network outside China. And that's, I think, one of the things that the CCP is very afraid of, is that this grassroots network that Falun Gong operates inside China is a mechanism by which their dirty laundry inside China can reach the free world, can reach the international community. And that's something that we saw, and I was just thinking about that as you were running through it. So let's, to wrap up, Weiyu, let's go back to you. Looking back over the last 25 years, what's the legacy of April 25th mean for you?
Okay, thank you, Levi. That's a very good question, and it's not easy to answer, but for now, I just have 2 points. The first one is, I think Falun Gong is the first group that revealed clearly what a CCP is to the whole world. And now more and more people realize that, right? So I think it's the first thing, the legacy to the world. The second point is I think the faith is most important thing to the human. And I mean, without faith, we cannot, insist on just clarifying the truth to the whole world. It's very difficult. So you can see the result. 25 years have passed, and the Chinese Communist Party has spared no effort using the most vicious means. I mean, so in an attempt to completely eradicate a peaceful and kind faith group. The facts prove that the Falun Gong has not been eliminated by the CCP. But on the contrary, there are more and more Falun Gong practitioners in the world and in China even. Moreover, people around the world are increasingly recognizing the evil nature of the CCP. So this fact once again confirms a truth. We say it a lot of times in Chinese, because it's a truth in China. Everybody knows that evil cannot prevail over righteousness. Good and evil will receive their due retribution. That's my thought. Thank you.
Larry, I guess same question for you. Looking back, what's the legacy of April 25th, you think?
Yeah, throughout Chinese history, when there is a conflict between the people and the government, it always comes down to two results. One is passive submission, the other is violent rebellion. But Falun Gong takes neither approach. Rather, they take the third approach, and they launched this largest civil disobedience movement and the information freedom campaign in modern Chinese history. The April 25th appeal is the beginning and also the epitome moment of this historic movement. That's the legacy of April 25th to me.
I see. Okay. And maybe Sarah, let's end with you. Looking at April 25th, it obviously intersects with broader trends that you're seeing. Maybe you could talk to us about that.
Sure. I mean, I think looking at April 25th or really even July 20th and up to today, what stands out in a lot of ways is the futility of the CCP's efforts to repress religious believers. Because look, in July 20, certainly Jiang Zemin didn't expect this, that 25 years later, Falun Gong would have survived. And I think a lot of people who were watching what was happening then wouldn't have expected that, even less so that you would have non-practitioners that were helping, whether it was human rights lawyers or neighbors or even some local policemen, trying to protect Falun Gong practitioners. And so actually, I think you see that the campaign against Falun Gong in many ways is, a failure of the party's repressive apparatus. And then in fact, what ended up happening in some ways, April 25th epitomizes this too, is that as repression was intensifying, it backfired. That you had all of these people who didn't see themselves as being political, didn't have any problem with the CCP, just wanted to live their lives. And suddenly the CCP's actions, turned them into people who were planning to appeal, people who would go and stand in line outside of Zhongnanhai and then later become these grassroots information activists. I mean, some of them are young tech savvy people. Some of them are grandparents, They have to learn to use the computer in order to jump the firewall and print something out to hand to a neighbor. And I think when we were doing the research, so that project in 2017, Falun Gong was one of 8 faiths that 8 religious communities that we looked at. It included Buddhists and Taoists, Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghurs, and Hui Muslims. And so I think those dynamics weren't really isolated to Falun Gong, because we really saw members of all faith communities, maybe perhaps not on the same scale or certainly the geographic diversity if you're talking about communities like in Tibet and Xinjiang, but also taking incredible risks and having, I think this element of just courage and sometimes scoring, real victories. And so I think what you see is that these efforts to change people's actual beliefs, even with all of this brutality, even with all of the billions of dollars, that the CCP hasn't been able to do that. And I think that's one of the things that really comes out. And that really, comes up to today. Another project Freedom House has running now is called the China Dissent Monitor. And it monitors activities of dissent across China, including from among religious communities. And actually the last issue, we published had actually documented about 200 cases of dissent that had occurred, I would say basically over the last 2 years, since mid-2022. First of all, the largest, contingent was from Falun Gong practitioners, but there were also incidents involving Uyghurs and Tibetans, involving Christians. And so I think you have this situation where again, the expansion of repression ends up backfiring and triggering this reaction where various Chinese citizens end up becoming more active, end up engaging in more dissent, simply because they feel that you want to practice their faith. Some of that dissent is more passive. It's just simply being able to practice and read spiritual or religious texts, with their fellow believers. Others are more proactive that involve maybe even sometimes, protests or sit-ins to try to stop a cross being taken down off of a church. or things, or Tibetans holding, maintaining pictures of the Dalai Lama, even though that can, that can land them in jail. So I think that's what really stands out, is just that powerful element of the spiritual resilience. The sad thing is that still the human and the financial and even the cost to governance in China are just massive in terms of these repressive campaigns. It's just incredible when you think about it. It's just heartbreaking. And some of those impacts, certainly when we're talking about lives lost, are essentially irreversible.
Okay. Why don't we've got 15 minutes to go. Thank you, everybody, for that. I think what we do is we'll turn to our questions now. Let's look at some of the questions that people that have joined us have sent them. And if you got a question, you haven't typed it in, just a reminder, on the lower right, there should be a little questions button. You can enter it there. Why don't we turn to those and see in the last 12 minutes or so here if we can answer some questions that have come up. So the first one we have talks about who organized the appeal, since so many people came from different provinces. So I imagine you're talking about the Falun Gong practitioners. Who got everybody there? Who organized that? So Weiyu, why don't we give that one to you? You could start us on that.
Oh yeah. So in fact, if I say I said many times, but looks like they still have such kind of question: who just organized you? In fact, nobody. Because we are just fellow practitioners in different schools, in different regions, different cities. We do not have a direct connection with one body. The other one was no special person there. But when I was practicing Falun Gong in the morning as usual, in April 24th, I just heard some other practitioners are talking about these things. So this is not just suddenly when we got the information, we got something from a organizer. No, it's gradually. I just described from 1998, and I experienced two incidents. One is the Beijing television station incident. The other one is the Tianjin incident. So we are trying to looking for some kind of information. We know the CCP is trying to do something to contain us, or just to impose a lot of restrictions on us. So we are very sensitive at that time, because we want to know what's the next step. When we heard some practitioners were caught or just arrested in Tianjin. Tianjin is very near to Beijing, so I think a lot of people just talk about this to their friends or to other practitioners, and that is why after that day, the second day, it's Sunday, we all have the time, so we just go to Beijing petition. And because we got this information from the Tianjin police, the Tianjin police department told us, if you want to release them, just go to Beijing. Only Beijing can save them. Nobody can release them without the command from the national leadership. Nobody can release them. So we do not have any other options. We are just told to do that. We were told to do that at that time. So that's my answer. I'm not sure if that can answer your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add that.
I'll add something after. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, from what I learned from my mother at that time in China, it's really just word of mouth. Because practitioners, they know each other from workplace in the same neighborhood, and word just spread very quickly. And so that's how she learned about this. And she wasn't really, nobody really told her to go. But she just learned that, practitioner being arrested in Tianjin, and now they were told to go to Beijing to appeal. And so she want to go. So that's kind of what I learned through my mother.
I would just add, you have to remember the information context surrounding Falun Gong then was very different from now. Now it's one of the most taboo topics, one of the most censored topics. Like you can't send an email to somebody, and without it getting blocked or getting called in by police because you got an email from overseas about Falun Gong, right? You can't send a message or anything like that. Now, on the one hand, technologically, it wasn't as advanced. People didn't have smartphones then, but there were some cell phones. There were certainly, landlines in a lot of parts of the country. There was internet. I mean, at the time, I mean, one of the things that really galvanized the tightening of the Great Firewall was the CCP's campaign against Falun Gong. Jiang Zemin ordered that the Great Firewall be built up more. I remember talking to someone, you know, this was 1997, and you know, you could access information about June 4th on the internet. It was still the early years, and you know, only so many people had access to the internet. But I think this wasn't a situation like you have now, where Falun Gong basically in China has to operate essentially underground, right? You know, any of the normal channels of communication, you pick up the telephone, you know, to call your parents in another province, or you know, that was pretty normal. And then also this element of, you know, the practice sites, right? So that's kind of how Falun Gong was organized. There isn't like there aren't churches, there isn't a clergy. There are these practice sites where people go in the morning, they do their exercise. And as you saw from Levi's video pictures, some of those were very big. And so if one person from that local practice site heard from other people in another city, and then they went in the morning, because people would go every morning, sometimes ridiculously early, like at 4 a.m. in the cold, in the snow, you know, to go and do the exercises. And so then that's how people would hear. But I just wanted to make that point about the information environment being so different, because it wasn't at the time, you know, Falun Gong wasn't the censored taboo subject that it is today.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let's go to another question we have. And this is a question that we get a lot, and it's a very good question, I think. Why does the suppression of Falun Gong get the least amount of coverage worldwide? We haven't really seen Falun Gong in the front page of mainstream media, or in mainstream media at all, really, in many, many years. Why is that? Maybe, Sarah, why don't we start with you on your perspective on this, and then, you know, Weiyu, Larry, you can weigh in as well.
It's a tricky question, and part of it is, you know, I don't fully understand it myself, because I think when you look at coverage of Uyghurs or Tibetans, in some of these cases, you could almost switch the names and it would be almost exactly the same thing. And you know, certainly when you see, you know, there has been coverage of, say, human rights lawyers who defended Falun Gong practitioners, and they'll get a lot of attention. But I think there are a few things. One is the taboo nature of Falun Gong and the danger for Falun Gong practitioners in China to speak to journalists, and very early on, and the reprisals that journalists can face if they speak to Falun Gong practitioners in China, in terms of being denied visas and things like that. And then there's a variety of other incentives and things like that, and pressures that are applied you know, onto media. We just did a big report called Beijing's Global Media Influence, you know, and this is across a wide range of issues and pressure that's applied. But one of the things we found, you know, censorship on topics that are sensitive to the Chinese Communist Party in 24 out of the 30 countries that we looked at, you know, and Falun Gong is a particularly sensitive one. I think one of the things, you know, I think the other thing is that, I mean, I think you do sometimes see some coverage, though not as much as you would see. And I think part of it is that there's so much of this kind of, you know, underground activity happening. People aren't protesting on Tiananmen Square. It's not so visible. And so that does make it harder, you know, for media, especially broadcast media, you know, to cover it. But I don't know if Larry has other thoughts.
Oh, Larry, you're muted.
I think there are probably, you know, a few reasons. You know, I don't really know what's in their minds, you know, in some of the mainstream media's editor or reporters' minds, but I can, you know, speculate a few things. You know, for example, in 2019, you know, we mentioned about the China Tribunal in London, and one of the New York Times previous Beijing correspondent, Didi Kirsten-Tatlow, submitted a written testimony to the China Tribunal. And in the testimony, she said that, because she has done a few reporting about China's organ transplant, you know, transition, you know, etc., reform, so-called. And so she had a lunch with a few Chinese transplant surgeons, actually, in 2016 at that time. And she speaks fluent Chinese, so she overheard their small talks, which indicates that the organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience is common knowledge among Chinese transplant surgeons. And also, the small talk also indicate that some of the Chinese transplant surgeons were not even aware that the Chinese government announced in December 2014 that they stopped using organs from, you know, executed prisoners. All organs in China will be from voluntary donor, you know, nothing from prisoners anymore. You know, that was already more than 1 year after that announced supposedly ban, but even Chinese transplant surgeon didn't know that. So she wanted to pursue that story, but the New York Times editors told her, no, there's nothing there. Chinese government already said that they stopped using organs from prisoners, and there's nothing there. And and later on she left the New York Times. So this is just kind of one example, but there are also many other examples that Western media self-censored, especially on Falun Gong. And I remember in Andrew Drucker, who wrote a book about the global activism in global China. In that book, he mentioned that, also among China scholars, Falun Gong is among the most taboo topics. And so certainly there is a higher cost for media to report on Falun Gong. And for Uyghurs, Tibetans, certainly the CCP has been trying very hard to eliminate their culture, religious identity, and did terrible things to them. But the CCP might not necessarily feel threatened. Their power, they don't necessarily feel being threatened by either group, because they are in the far west region, but Falun Gong is in the heartline of China, and the information freedom campaign that Falun Gong has been launched is also awakening a lot of Chinese people, really changing the hearts and minds of many Chinese people, help them to see through the lies of the CCP. So there is certainly a higher cost, more retributions if a media report on Falun Gong. So that could be, one reason. Another reason could be just, Falun Gong is, less familiar, to many Westerners, and there could be also some secular bias towards a Buddhist-based religious spiritual group. So that could be another reason. So that's just my thoughts. Okay, very good. Let's see if we have time for one more question here. We'll do one quick question that's come in here. One question came in and said, they've heard a lot about Chinese government influence abroad, and does this affect Falun Gong practitioners? I assume they mean outside of China. Who'd like to take that one? Sarah, go ahead.
I can start off with it. And then I'd be very curious to hear if Weiyu's or Larry have experienced any of these things individually. I mean, look, in general, the Chinese Communist Party and Freedom House has done work on what we call transnational repression. That's where you have a government that goes after its exile and diaspora communities in particular to try to physically attack them, monitor them, sometimes kill them, bring them home. And actually, Freedom House created a database of these cases around the world. And there are actually, probably I think maybe 15 to 20 countries that are generally authoritarian and that engage in this kind of behavior. But we found that by far the Chinese government engages in the most sophisticated and most comprehensive of the campaigns of transnational repression in the world, and targeting a variety of different groups. And Falun Gong is one of them. They target Uyghurs, they target Tibetans, they now target Hong Kongers. But Falun Gong practitioners have been really one of the longest running targets, whether it's for surveillance, whether it's for harassing family in China of people who are active overseas, sometimes even detaining and sentencing them to prison. A lot of times Falun Gong practitioners, if there's a Chinese official that might be going overseas, Falun Gong practitioners will do small peaceful protests and banners asking them to end the persecution, asking them to release family members. And then there have been various incidents where there are these Chinese thugs accompanying the Chinese leader, and they'll go and attack or rip off banners. Sometimes it's from other proxy groups. This actually happened in San Francisco when Xi Jinping was here for APEC late last year. There were incidents like that, both against Falun Gong practitioners and against other communities like Uyghurs or Tibetans. So I think you see, that happens. But I think it's often the surveillance, the harassment of the family in China that, sometimes you'll see an incident and it'll pop up, and that'll just be really the tip of the iceberg, because it's just this much more systematic influence efforts and intimidation that is happening much more widely in many more places. And so I think that's some of what we see in terms of the party's transnational repression, including against Falun Gong practitioners. But Weiyu and Larry, I don't know if you guys have experienced any of this yourselves.
I just want to maybe add something additional to what Sarah has already described. I think in 2009, I was actually attending Shenyun shows at the Kennedy Center, and my car was broken into just right outside the Kennedy Center. It was a pretty safe neighborhood, actually, and my car was broken into. My laptop in the trunk was stolen, and my car is actually a very old Toyota Corolla. One of the cheapest car. Looking at all the other cars on the street, most of them are better than my car, actually. But why they broke into my car? And I thought because I had a little thing, on the rear mirror, and which has the Chinese character Zhen Shanren. So it's pretty clear for any Chinese, this is somebody who practiced Falun Gong. So my car was broken into, my laptop was stolen at that time. So on note of that, I just want to mention a little more about the CCP's transnational repression against Shenyun, which is a performing arts group founded by Falun Gong practitioners. And so throughout these years, CCP has been carrying out at least more than 100 cases targeting Shenyun, for example, forcing theaters to cancel the show, and some countries like in South Korea, Ecuador, some other countries that were vulnerable to CCP's political economic influence indeed canceled the show and caused a lot of the financial damage, certainly to Shenyun. And but Shenyun is really trying to revive the traditional Chinese culture and showing people what China was like before communism. So it's certainly something that the CCP wouldn't like. And I think just the past month, and CCP really escalated this transnational repression to Shenyun, and they even sent a bomb threat and a mass shooting threat to Shenyun and also to different theaters, various theaters in North America that Shenyun performs, and threatening to even, cause physical harm, detonate a bomb, things like that. And so that's really what happened to Shenyun right now.
So I just want to, we'll end on this. I wanted to add one thing, though, that I was thinking about when Larry was talking, is that, back in 1999, when the persecution first started, the leader of the CCP, Jiang Zemin at that time, had his final meeting with then President Bill Clinton at the APEC meeting. And one of the first things he did, and the most obvious thing he did, was bring a stack of anti-Falun Gong propaganda and gave it to President Clinton. And that, I think what that shows you is not only it's the priority of to malign Falun Gong, to eradicate Falun Gong of the CCP, and the level that they're going to go to utilize their economic ties, their diplomatic ties, everything that they've got at their disposal to do that. And so I think it's hard to, coming back to this question of what the transnational repression has been, it's hard to overstate how the CCP, as its stature on the world stage has grown, and it's got greater economic leverage, it's got greater political leverage, the degree to which it can use that at every turn to advance this campaign to squish Falun Gong. And that's really at the heart, I think, of a lot of the serious transnational repression, whether it's keeping silent about Falun Gong, where it's scaring away would-be supporters, whether it's trying to get bad stories written about it. It is the full might and power of the Communist Party on the world stage that is targeting Falun Gong. And we very much feel that and have for 25 years.
Levi, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
Yeah, just on note of what you just said, a 2017 internal CCP government document was leaked, actually. In that document, CCP laid out their strategy of targeting Falun Gong overseas. One of their strategy is to develop friendly experts, scholars, Chinese community leader, and also Western media, Western mainstream media, and so to tote their line on Falun Gong so that they report more in the line of CCP's narrative. And we have seen that taking place. One thing is we have seen some of the so-called scholars or some of the media actually simply keep silent about the persecution, the scale and scope, even try to play down that. But on the other hand, we saw that they distorted some of the teaching of Falun Gong's belief. So we have seen that happening, and that's exactly what's laid out in CCP's transnational repression in their internal documents. So this transnational repression is not only limited to physical violence and cyber attack, and but also in terms of the information, and because the information warfare is also one of the unrestricted warfare of CCP's strategy. So I just want to add to that.
Okay, thank you very much, Larry. Thank you for all the panelists. I just want to mention one thing before we leave. There is an award-winning film out there, called Unsilenced, a fantastic film, and it is based on the events of Weiyu Wang's life. In particular, a lot of the stuff that we've covered here today, what his life was like leading up to April 25th, what happened afterwards, what him and his friends and his family went through, is captured in this film in a very compelling way. It's available on all the streaming platforms, I assume, Weiyu. So if you're at all interested, I do encourage you guys to see that film. It's called Unsilenced. And with that, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you much for everybody for attending. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.